For decades, the direction of the global electronic supply chain was predictable. Components flowed out of China, final products were assembled there or nearby, and countries like India largely sat at the receiving end of that system. That's why what's happening right now is unusual, because for the first time, Indian firms are exporting components into that same supply chain.
India's electronics trade story is taking a surprising turn. For years, it was a one-way flow. India importing from China. Now, that direction is slowly reversing. India is exporting electronics components to China, and the numbers are massive.
Apple suppliers in India shipped components and sub-assemblies worth $2.5 billion. Our report suggests that at this pace, Indian electronics exports to Beijing could reach $3.5 billion when the final numbers for the full financial year are in. This is a sharp rise of $920 million in Indian exports to China in the financial year that ended in 2025.
Not just to Western markets, but back into China and Vietnam themselves.
Why is India exporting to China, which is still called the factory of the world? Because global supply chains are changing. As Apple scales production in India, the country now accounts for around 25% of global iPhone output. That means Indian suppliers are now competitive enough to supply components not just locally, but to global assembly lines, including those in China.
At first glance, this looks like a simple trade update, but it isn't. It's an early signal of something much larger.
Electronics manufacturing is now growing at a double-digit CAGR. Very rapidly it is expanding.
So the real question is, does this mark the beginning of India's entry into global electronics manufacturing in a meaningful way? Or is it still too early to say? To answer that, you have to go back a few years to a shift that almost no one paid attention to at the time. In 2019, India crossed an important but largely unnoticed milestone. It went from being a net importer of mobile phones to a net exporter. On paper, this was a trade statistic. In practice, it meant something more fundamental. India had finally entered the electronics production process, even if only at the final stage. At that point, most of the work happening inside the country was assembly. High-value components, semiconductors, displays, camera systems were still being imported, largely from East Asia. India's role was limited, but it was no longer absent. That distinction matters because in a supply chain as complex as electronics, entry at any level is often the prerequisite for moving upward. This wasn't accidental. If you look at China's export profile over the past 2 decades, one category consistently dominates in terms of value: electronics. Not because it is the simplest industry, but because it sits at the intersection of scale, technology, and global demand. For a country trying to expand its manufacturing base, electronics offers something unique. It is not just one industry, it is a platform industry. It connects into consumer devices, industrial systems, medical equipment, and even defense manufacturing. So if India wanted to build long-term manufacturing capability, targeting electronics was a logical starting point. But entering electronics manufacturing isn't as simple as setting up factories. The industry is structured as a layered supply chain where each stage requires different capabilities. At the base are raw materials, metals, rare earth elements, and silicon. Above that sit components, semiconductors, batteries, sensors, and displays, often produced by highly specialized firms like TSMC, Samsung, or Sony. These components are then integrated into modules or sub-assemblies, motherboards, camera systems, battery packs, before finally being brought together in assembly plants operated by firms like Foxconn or Pegatron. Each layer captures a different share of value and, more importantly, requires a different level of technological sophistication. Assembly is the most accessible entry point. Component design and fabrication sit at the top. For most of the past 2 decades, India was not meaningfully present at any of these layers. What India has done over the last few years is adopt a phased approach to entering this structure. The first step was to attract assembly. Through the Production Linked Incentive (PLI) scheme, companies like Foxconn and Wistron began assembling smartphones in India at scale. This is also where much of the criticism emerged, the argument being that assembly alone does not constitute real manufacturing. But that critique misses the sequencing. Assembly by itself does not create deep industrial capability, but it does something else. It creates demand. Once assembly operations reach a certain scale, they begin to pull in upstream suppliers, companies that produce components and sub-assemblies. That was the second phase. After assembly had scaled, India introduced incentives specifically targeting components. And more recently, the policy has moved further upstream with incentives for modules and a design-linked incentive scheme aimed at encouraging firms to build design capabilities domestically. The emphasis on design is particularly important, as the government has repeatedly indicated, including through statements by Ashwini Vaishnaw, long-term competitiveness in electronics depends less on assembling products and more on controlling the design and architecture behind them. Seen in that context, the recent development, Indian firms exporting components to China and Vietnam, looks less like a sudden breakthrough and more like the next step in that progression. Companies such as Motherson, Tata Electronics, Jabil, and Equus are now producing mechanical parts and components that feed into global supply chains. These components are being integrated into products like iPhones, MacBooks, and other devices before final assembly takes place in established manufacturing hubs. This does not mean India has overtaken those hubs, but it does mean it has entered the system in a way that was not true a few years ago. It's important to be precise about what this represents. Most of the components currently being exported from India are relatively lower in complexity: enclosures, mechanical parts, and certain sub-assemblies. The highest value segments of the supply chain, particularly semiconductors and advanced electronics, remain concentrated elsewhere. So this is not the completion of the process. It is an early milestone. But milestones matter in manufacturing because they indicate direction. They show whether a country is moving deeper into the value chain or remaining stuck at the edges. And this is where the implications extend beyond electronics. Once a country builds capability in modules and components, those capabilities become transferable. The same ecosystem that supports electronics manufacturing can feed into sectors like medical devices, electric vehicles, and industrial equipment. In other words, electronics is not just an industry, it is a foundation. So the significance of this shift is not just that India is exporting components today, but that it is beginning to build the layers required to participate more fully in global manufacturing tomorrow. So, does this mean India has already become a global manufacturing power? Not yet. But it does suggest that the process has begun in a more structured way than before. Because the goal was never simply to assemble products, it was to move gradually into the deeper layers of the supply chain, from assembly to components, from components to modules, and eventually into design. And for the first time, there is visible evidence that this transition is underway. If you are interested in understanding how these long-term structural shifts are shaping India's economy, subscribe to Periscope, because the most important changes are often the ones that don't look dramatic at first, but end up defining what comes next.